Hello, I am Dorothy Linthicum, a fellow traveler on the journey we find ourselves on. Over 70, living apart from our communities during a pandemic event, fighting loneliness, anxiety, boredom, fears, real and imagined, sometimes all in the same day, or same hour, or in tandem in one moment. We are told by political leaders, doctors, scientists, our children, and our friends that we are at high risk for the COVID-19 virus, for our own health and safety, as well as that for people in our communities. We are asked or told to stay home and shelter in place. For the most part, we have listened and are doing our part to flatten the curve of the virus to protect others and ourselves, especially the healthcare professionals who are on the front lines. But the days and weeks are long, and our aloneness can easily become loneliness. Where is God in all of this? Especially for those of us sitting on the sidelines, living in the disconnect between tragedy and the intense beauty of a creation awakening to the warmth of spring. When I worked with adolescents at a much earlier point in my life, the truth I emphasized over and over was, they are never alone. God is always with them, even when they cannot feel God's presence. Perhaps this message needs to be our clarion call as we face this pandemic together, but alone. That's the message. We are never alone. God is always with us, even when we cannot feel or talk about God's presence. Paul says in Romans, "For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation, including viruses, will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord." Let's sit with that for a moment in silence. What does Paul's reassurance mean to you? How can you live into that promise today, tonight, tomorrow, and for all those days we still face? I invite you just breathe deeply and think about God's presence right now. What are our days like? The first reality for many of us is living with technology. I realize that a number of my older friends and colleagues have conquered not only their use of technology, but also the fear of it. However, that leaves many of us on the sidelines. We can worship 3 or more times a day at the church we are affiliated with, or another church in our region, or in another country entirely. We can order about anything online, including toilet paper, and get local delivery of groceries. We can Skype or Zoom or FaceTime and instantly be with friends, families, and colleagues. But all that takes a little skill, patience, and willingness to face our keyboards and iPhones alone. I have to add an aside here. Since lockdowns, social distancing, and constant hand washing became common practice, not once have I seen an eye roll or heard the words, "Okay, boomer," in general, or when I've requested help from younger people. There seems to be a real camaraderie that we are all in this together. I can now join my priest each day for morning prayer and later tap into a meditation from the cathedral where I worshipped when I lived in South Africa. I can call a group together on Zoom, and I've learned how to record video on my itty-bitty laptop change the file format, and drop it into a Google Cloud Drive. And I'm dusting off old skills and discovering unexpected pleasures. This week, I opened up my old Singer sewing machine to make a face mask for the good of the order. The first thing I saw was the accumulation of about 10 years or more of dust in and around the machine, including a spool of thread that I left behind on a long ago project. The two masks I constructed from fabric that I also rediscovered, along with cotton from old t-shirts, are not pretty, but they work. I confess that dip back into sewing will be short-lived. I discovered I still lack the patience that it requires. I'm finding pleasure in small things in life, like the blooms on an azalea bush my son gave me several years ago for Mother's Day. I look forward to FaceTiming or Skyping with my grandkids, both those living across town and in South Carolina. We are all aware of the deep suffering of so many in our country and the world, from lost income, hunger, illness, and death. But despite that knowledge, and though my life is not empty or bereft of the company of others, I am weary and tender, often a breath away from tears. So where is God in the midst of our lives today? I have been studying and teaching and talking about spirituality and aging for about 10 years. My intentional study began not long after my dad died of complications from Alzheimer's disease. I had been his primary caregiver. My mother had died 8 years earlier, also from Alzheimer's related issues. My first presentation at Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, designed by me and my colleague Lisa Kimball, targeted church and community leaders interested in ministry with older people. We called it Spirituality After 70. 2 part-time professionals who led programs in nearby District of Columbia signed up. The other 80-plus participants who came in person or joined us online were people over 70 looking for spirituality. We quickly redesigned the program, adding a hospice chaplain to our team, and started using pronouns like we and us instead of they and them. That workshop was a game changer for me, especially as my own understanding of my faith journey was enriched by the careful listening to those older than I and reading words of scholars and theologians. 7 years later, a former seminary student who is now a chaplain in a large retirement community, and I published a book called Redeeming Dementia. The writing of it reflected my awakening to the personhood of all people through God's love and grace. A favorite theologian that I discovered during the writing of that book, John Swinton from Scotland, helped me in that intellectual and spiritual shift. He wrote, "We are because God sustains us in God's memory. Our hope lies in the fact that we are living in the memories of God. As long as God remembers us, who we are will remain." That thought is bolstered by God's words in Isaiah. "I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands." I find these words comforting not only for those suffering from dementia, but for all of us, young and old, living in the uncertainty of a pandemic. I have discovered others along the way whose teachings and theology are helpful during these uncertain times. Franciscan brother Richard Rohr, in his book Falling Upward, A Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life, writes, There are two major tasks to human life. The task of the first half of life is to create a proper container for one's life and answer some central questions. Who am I? What makes me significant? How can I support myself? Who will go with me? The task of the second half of life, he says, is quite simply to find the actual contents that this container was meant to hold and deliver. In other words, the container is for the sake of the contents. For many of us, not all, the task of filling the container begins during the latter part of life, as we begin to slow down and look for deeper meaning. Some would argue that part of the task also entails getting rid of the unessential clutter we've accumulated in our containers along the way. I wonder if this might be a time for us to look inward, since the distractions of schedules and events have been so forcibly removed from our lives. Erik Erikson, a developmental theorist who spent a long time coming to terms with his own identity, was surprised by life when he got older. The descriptions he had so carefully crafted for stage 8, the elder years, didn't match his own experiences. There was a quality of life, or lack of quality, that he had not foreseen. His wife Joan, who was also his collaborator, described these changes in a new Stage 9. Stage 9 explores the reality of aging beyond the community life that is so much a part of the other 8 stages. Folding in Buddhist ideas with Western psychology, Joan Erikson describes a stage of transcendence that encompasses the search for meaning along with the losses that occur in old age. At about the same time, other theorists across the globe were describing similar discoveries. The word that arose from their findings is gerotranscendence. Joan Erikson uses that term to describe an almost complete regression at the end of life, while the theorist who first coined the term, Lars Torsten, describes it as an ascension. Ironically, their conclusions came from very similar observations. Torsten uses Erikson as a starting point and considers gerotranscendence, if achieved, to be the final stage of developing towards wisdom. In his view, an 85-year-old who may withdraw from some activities and socialization isn't deteriorating. She's evolving. Let me take a step back and tell you a story told by Torsten himself to illustrate this term. He begins by describing a hypothetical daughter planning a cocktail party. Her elderly mother usually attends the affairs and enjoys herself, so the daughter invites her as usual. But this time, the mother declines. "Oh my goodness," says the daughter. She's naturally worried. Is her mother depressed? Is she ill? This isn't like her. But perhaps, says Torsten, there's nothing wrong. Our values and interests don't usually remain static from the time we're 20 years old until the time we're 45. So why do we expect this sort of consistency in the later decades? We develop and change, he says. We mature. It's a process that goes on all of our lives, and it doesn't ever end. The mistake we make in middle age is thinking that good aging means continuing to be the way we were at 50. Well, maybe it's not. An increased need for solitude and the company of only a few intimates is one of the traits Torsten attributes to this continuing maturation. So that elderly mother isn't deteriorating necessarily. She's evolving towards wisdom. People tell us there are different people at 80, Torsten explains. They have new interests and they have left some things behind. So maybe this time of unplanned solitude we are living in during these difficult pandemic days is giving us a chance to evolve, to answer some questions we have avoided and understand our place in the world. Torsten breaks down the term gerotranscendence this way. It comes from the words gero, meaning old age in Greek, and transcendence, meaning to climb over in Latin. Gerotranscendence is a developmental stage that occurs when an individual who is living into old age shifts their perspective from a materialistic and rational view of the world to a more cosmic and transcendent one, normally accompanied by an increase in life satisfaction. Or, in layman's terms, one who prefers a quiet night at home to a noisy cocktail party. Research shows that gerotranscendence adult elders are less self-occupied and more altruistic. As they age, they often become more selective in their choices of social and other activities. They avoid social interactions they judge to be unnecessary. Gerotranscendent elders reported decreased interest in material things, viewing too many possessions as burdensome. I have been surprised, as friends who first lamented the loss of things as they had to downsize, came to actually enjoy and appreciate a world with fewer material goods to dust and store. We often have a greater need for alone time, for thought and meditation, referred to as positive solitude. We sometimes find ourselves simply accepting the mysteries of life, acknowledging we can't understand everything. When gerotranscendence older adults reflect back on their lives, they realize that the pieces of their life's jigsaw puzzle really do form a whole. But putting these pieces together takes time in thought and contemplation. So maybe a lockdown isn't a burden to be borne, but an opportunity to grow through a careful process of life review. How does this relate to spirituality? Have you ever tried to define your own personal spirituality? I had assumed I had a handle on this until I began to define it for myself. When I was at a gathering in Texas for older adults, I met someone named Robert Atchley, who wrote a book called Spirituality and Aging. Well, by the time I met him, he had completed his seminal work and research and preferred to entertain people by playing the guitar and singing silly songs. But then when I read his book, I discovered why he was in such demand and how his definition for spirituality began to define my own. Actually defined 3 forms of spirituality. Number 1, an intense awareness of the present. Number 2, transcendence of the personal self, which is what we just talked about. And number 3, a feeling of connection with all of life, the universe, a supreme being, or great web of being, or for some of us, God. Those 3 aspects of spirituality, which are relevant to all ages, are guideposts for healthy living. We need to remain in touch with those around us. We need to wrestle with the needs of our community and the world, and to define the impact of our actions on those we love and for neighbors that we don't even know. By transcending the personal self, moving to a new plane of understanding, we can look to the past for help in living in the present. And finally, we don't have to do this alone. God is with us and walks with us all along the way, even when we can't feel God's presence. I will confess that reading ideas from people like Bob Atchley and Richard Rohr and Lars Tornstam, and learning about research into areas like gerotranscendence has given me a new perspective about growing old and spending time alone. It looks very inviting. Maybe it is why studies show that older people are more likely to express contentment than younger folk. Instead of resigning ourselves to another afternoon of mindless television or even a nap, maybe we should treat ourselves by spending time with a memory that still makes us smile, even at a distance. I will note that when I teach this topic to younger students who are in their 20s, they take furious notes, but I can tell they just don't quite get it yet. Alain Brodie, a gerontologist who studied aging for many years, had this to say: "My present perspective, then, is that of an 86-year-old woman who, I suppose, was prepared for old age intellectually, but not emotionally. Even my children, who are growing into the stages of life that I studied, are facing the same things. Common experiences of old age, such as illness and loss, were unexpected, even though expectable. What I have learned and what I continue to learn is that I can bone up intellectually about growing older, but it doesn't help me deal with those unexpected times of life, even though they are expectable. Like the death of a close friend who has been very ill, or moving to a retirement community I've been thinking about for years, or being surprised that the COVID-19 virus is having a direct impact on my life. What is comforting comes from deep memories that bring back satisfying feelings by transcending the present to enter a place of quiet joy. It can give us a place of escape that brings us respite and comfort, even when we're not able to be in the present because of grief, illness, or other infirmities. The ability to move from the present to a different time and place is to enter an alternate reality, where time stands still or moves rapidly from event to event. By letting go of the present, we allow ourselves and others to inhabit a place that no longer exists in a world bound by linear time. So how can our own alternate realities that can calm fears and even bring joy, where are they? How can we find them? Those working with people who have dementia have discovered the power of memory boxes, filled with memory cues that take the form of written stories, poetry, photos, music, scrapbooks, and other memorabilia. I have my own memory box. The first thing I put into it was an old Baptist hymnal from my childhood. I am an Episcopalian, and I've been an Episcopalian for years, but that hymnal does not speak to my heart like those old hymns I sang as a child. I also have an iPod with my own choices of music, not necessarily recent, but certainly my own choices. I don't want others to make those choices for me, and I have charged my children to make sure the technology stays current. Recently, I worked with two groups of people over age 65 to explore the spirituality of aging. The sessions we spent together were framed in the context of memory boxes, collecting objects that defined our identity for ourselves and for others. Each time we came together, we looked at scripture and statistics and theory to give us a better understanding of our own aging, the meaning of spirituality, and where God is in our journeys. Against that backdrop, we began to explore our own thoughts and fears about aging while we tapped into our memories. Although we focused on 3 types of memories for our boxes: stories, photos, and music, some participants added their own mementos as well. One brought an old skate key hanging on a string, an essential tool for the tightening of skates on hard-soled shoes. It reminded the group of the joy of skating and the freedom of skates to explore the boundaries of their neighborhood. Others shared photos that elicited stories, often accompanied with peals of laughter, a tender smile, or sometimes a tear. We were reminded gently that these memories are a part of us, companions on our journey. My older friends tell me that when they tap into deep memories, they sometimes experience the feelings of being a child, a young person, an adult, and an older adult, all in one moment. This view of time allows them to reevaluate old events, to gain new perspectives, and provides opportunities to right old wrongs. Growing old may sound like an oxymoron, two words that don't belong together. As a culture, we are far more likely to associate aging with decline rather than growth. In 2 Corinthians, Paul addresses the fragility of our bodies. He reminds us that our outer nature is wasting away. Since we were toddlers, we put great value on our ability to do things alone, by ourselves. But we begin to see with our own eyes the decline of the outer nature of our loved ones and ourselves that leaves us sometimes feeling sad, angry, and afraid, and certainly powerless. But Paul finishes his thought by saying our inner nature is being renewed day by day. With each year of life, we add another year in relationship to God. With each new day, we experience moments of grace. Life is not easy, Paul notes. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. This kind of spiritual resiliency is nurtured in community, which now we only can experience digitally, online. It is the experience, though, of being knocked down and stunned by events and finding a familiar voice, or the FaceTime images of friends or family as they offer hands of support and comfort and encouragement. Those assist us in once again rising. It is the experience of faith, hope, and love shared through our various connections in life that nurtures our inner renewal. This is why we need to initiate phone calls to others to stay connected, or drop a note or postcard in the mail. Our voice may be the encouragement a lonely friend or relative hears at a critical point, no matter how old they are. It is important that each of us does not lose heart. This slight momentary affliction, says Paul, is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure. As you or someone you love is confronted during the difficult days of this pandemic with loneliness, anxiety, fear, or the unexpectedness of the expected, tap into the power of deepest memories and the hope of the resurrection for comfort and sustenance. And keep these words of Paul in your heart. Do not lose heart.